Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 21 of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre. With me is Z. Before we get to topics, we do have a few notes. For one, I did put out the video on Wednesday of the Android binder use after free streams I was doing. So the supercut, it's all finished and up. I got it down to about 90 minutes, which is pretty impressive because all the raw footage was about 25 hours with all the tangents and stuff we went on. But we managed to get it down to 90 minutes, so that's on our YouTube if you want to check that out.
Did he go ahead and include any of those tangents?
I included a few, but not some of the bigger ones. Like one tangent I went on that was big was like trying to dump my phone's kernel. I didn't include that. Maybe I'll make that into a separate video if people want it. But for now, it's just like what's up was mostly relevant to the exploit that I was looking at.
Which makes sense to cut it down to just that.
Yeah. The other thing is I'm going to be doing a makeup stream this Wednesday because I didn't stream the Friday of last week.
Are we getting into beauty streams or like that type of makeup?
Yeah, that kind of makeup. I just wasn't feeling very well on that Friday, so we moved it to this Wednesday. And then there was one thing about the last podcast. So on the last podcast we covered the IDA demo release. And there's one major point that I think we forgot to mention that I think I would like to bring up now is just that that IDA demo release can't save IDBs, which I'm not sure how we missed, but that is a very important point.
Yeah, well, I don't think any have been able to do IDBs, have they? As far as I know, you've always had to kind of
the free
do that
versions
every
can,
time.
I'm pretty sure. But the demo version
I'd want to
didn't.
double check with that. I don't think free versions have been able to. Because that whole analysis time has kind of been one of the, it intentionally brought in hindrances, like encouraging you to pay for it. Part of that's because of that. Money. Yeah, well, so like I said, I haven't used the free version. Like I mentioned during the last episode, I haven't used the free version in quite a while. So maybe I'm mistaken, but I don't think saving IDBs has been in there for, ever.
Okay, but anyway, I just wanted to bring that up. I can't remember if we mentioned it. I don't think we did. So I just wanted to add that quick addition before we started. So yeah, we'll get into some topics. So our first topic is Android permanent DoS. So this is a Unicode issue.
Yeah, I guess this is kind of our headliner for the stream. So it seems like another one of those Unicode issues, as you're saying. It's something we've seen back in Unicode of Death back in 2015. It's kind of like an iMessage one. And I remember, I want to say 2018, we had two of them. There's an iOS one, and there was like the Black Point on Android.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it ended 2018 that was.
Yeah, I think it was early 2018, actually. So I remember it still being...
Was it early?
Yeah, I want to say like February.
I don't remember it being long ago, but maybe it was.
Okay. But I don't know. I remember people linking it over in that Netcat Discord server, and there was some kid that ended up in a boot loop because of it.
Yep. Yeah, because the messages, like, because they would show up on the home screen or the lock screen or whatever, like, reboot, you just keep boot looping. It kind of sucked.
Yeah, and it seems like this is basically that exact same style issue, just another Unicode character that causes a crash. I don't think we've got any indication of what the actual character is at this point. I didn't go looking for it too much. I know.
Hopefully it's not out there, honestly.
Yeah, that's definitely something that, kids will start, tweeting out. And who was it? I think with the Android Black Point, I remember somebody changed their name on Uber to have that in their name and then crashed all of the Uber driver phones.
Oh, wow. I don't remember hearing about that. That sucks.
So, I mean, it's one of those issues just because Unicode is so prevalent. I mean, it's quite literally everywhere. When you find these issues, they can definitely be abused. And once this character gets out there, I can't imagine it not being, everybody doing at everybody on Discord or, wherever else you can get an alert with the character, basically.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's kind of weird that I'm trying to look for a little bit is they're kind of vague. So they say the product versions that are affected, like Android Oreo 8.0, 8.1, 9, Android 10. But they don't like. Are all phone models vulnerable? Like, are all devices vulnerable that use Android?
Yeah, so it seems like this, it's right there in handle run of textline.java. So it's right there kind of in the core system. It's not like just part of, Discord's rendering or something, as an example. So yeah, it would be like all Androids would be vulnerable.
Yeah. I mean, I must say, I'm a bit surprised these issues still exist, especially the Unicode ones. Like, I feel like those are the types of issues that you have fuzzers for. Like, fuzzers should kill a lot of those bugs fairly quickly.
It is, but it's also the type of thing that there are just so many combinations for that's so easy to kind of miss. Like the old Black Point one was repeating the 200 or 0x 20OF and 20OE like 3,000 times to get the crash.
Yeah, but
like a fuzzer could pick that up, but if one of the random elements ends up breaking the chain, all of a sudden it kind of gets the system gets a bit of a relief, and it can keep working basically.
That's fair. That's a fair outlier. But yeah, it just feels like one of those issues. It is a lot easier to hit with fuzzing compared to like some other issues. Real Nano user said, it isn't vulnerable, Nano. That's absolutely true. We should all just use Nano. But yeah, this issue, they just put it in the security bulletin on the 1st, so there's probably a lot of devices that are vulnerable to this. Because I don't even know. Like, yeah, they put out a patch, but with these devices and stuff, the way that patches make it to phones,
it's going to take a little while.
Process.
I mean, I know Google's been trying to hold the OEMs to the fire a bit and getting them to update quicker, but yeah, it's still definitely an issue.
Yeah, so there's probably a lot of people out there that are vulnerable to this. So, maybe I don't know if you'd want to turn off text. I don't know if can you turn off text notifications for numbers you don't know? I wonder if you could do that.
From numbers you don't know. I mean, you probably can. You can probably just block SMS, but I still feel like, big place is anybody that's using, the Twitter, anything that has those alerts with user-generated content.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, just look out for it. Because it is out there.
You'll know when you get it.
try to avoid it, do whatever you can. So our next big thing was the inferring and hijacking VPN-tunneled TCP connections, which was posted on the sec lists. So this talks about inferring information about people using a VPN. So finding the VPN's virtual IP, monitoring active connections on it, and they mentioned pulling off a TCP hijack. This attack does require kind of a high conditional in the fact that you have to have a maliciously controlled access point or something like that, which if you don't connect to any Wi-Fi,
it definitely requires a privileged attacker.
Yeah.
Whether it doesn't, strictly speaking, it doesn't require the access point, but for the important things it does require the access point. Like for the actual injecting, you do require that access point. Which is basically comes down to you need to be able to see in their example with injecting messages and trying to figure out the acknowledgement numbers and stuff, and the sequence number, and trying to do that you need to be able to witness the packets going out. So there are probably other ways you can do it besides a rogue access point. Our poisoning comes to mind, for example, which I mean in a sense just turns you into their access point, but so you need that sort of access. So whether that be by being the access point or something else, it's just you need to be able to see the actual network traffic going through that isn't directed at you.
Yeah, and I think what made it more impactful was the fact that, I thought for the TCP hijack that TLS thwarted it completely, but it seems that you kind of corrected me on that, that this can actually, even if HTTPS is being used, you can still inject
You can inject, just not like you can inject. So technically speaking, you can do it. Realistically speaking, because it's encrypted, you don't know the content to inject. So like you're not able to do something meaningful with that. But just to kind of give people an idea here, essentially like this whole issue, the first paragraph here actually sums it up reasonably well. Which is basically, you can determine, it allows a network adjacent attacker to determine if another user is connected to a VPN, the virtual IP address that they have been assigned by that VPN, whether or not there is an active connection to a given website, presumably through that VPN. And then you can determine the sequence and acknowledgement numbers by counting the encrypted packets or looking at their size in order to inject data into that TCP stream. Because this whole attack takes place kind of that TCP level, and in how some Linux distros, not all distros, will basically respond to invalid requests or not respond, and kind of inferring information from that. But because it all takes place at that low level, the fact that it's encrypted doesn't really matter, or doesn't have a big impact. It does, you don't know what to actually inject when you're able to inject your own packets, but you could inject packets because you do have the proper sequence and acknowledgement numbers to actually craft that spoof packet. And I mean, for the most part, in terms of how this actually works, it's a lot of brute force. So your attacker, the first step of it is sending SYNAC packets basically across the entire IP space to your victim, and see when they respond with a reset packet, which basically tells you, okay, that IP you sent it to is their valid IP. And this requires a not strictly speaking a misconfiguration, but the RP filter setting. Basically, by default, it's set to strict, in which case it'll just ignore kind of, this random IPs, or basically the inappropriate interface sending you packets from an IP it shouldn't be, which is what you're kind of doing with this. So systemd will change that RP filter from strict to loose, which then means it kind of ignores who this is coming from and just responds to it as though it was a valid or appropriate source for that packet.
Okay, so what worries you more, the monitoring aspect or the packet injection aspect?
Monitoring.
Yeah, I would say that too.
And just kind of carry on with that a little bit, about how this kind of works is you send those packets across the entire space. So you get that RST telling you, hey, that was a valid IP, to test if there's an active connection. Then once you know that valid IP, you spoof the IP that you want to inquire about. So who do you think they might be connected to? And basically brute force every possible destination port, like on the victim. And again, if the connection doesn't exist, then it'll send a reset packet, and if it does exist, it'll send a challenge act to you. So that's how you can know that they're connected to something. So that can happen regardless of TLS.
Okay, so TLS does mitigate it a little bit, but not like just in the fact that it's harder to inject impactful frames and getting the actual data going across, right? Like it doesn't, TLS doesn't prevent it or anything, but it does kind of make it not as bad.
It adds an extra layer of effort, which is, I would say even that layer of effort, like it's basically impossible to get around that. I mean, without some significant crypto breaking, like because you need either the key, you need to be able to spoof a legitimate packet. It's not happening to actually inject. Like, I don't think the injection is going to be very likely, but being able to spy on someone, I mean, that becomes a little bit more likely, but this does require a very privileged attacker. Like, this probably isn't happening on your home network. Or if it is happening on your home network, it's probably because, like, you're completely compromised already, like your device is compromised, and not from an attack like this. I just like this because it is a cool little attack. It's taking advantage of the IP stack, sending out the reset or just behaving appropriately and being able to infer information about that. That's why I think this is kind of a cool attack. in practice, it's definitely limited where we're going to see this used.
I mean, one place you could see it used is somewhere like conferences, like DEF CON or something like that. I imagine quite a few people who use those access points probably do use a VPN. So in those kinds of situations, I could see this being a practical attack.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, generally you want to avoid doing anything sensitive from DEF CON anyhow. But the thing is with this, like, the main thing you're getting out of it is that monitoring. So you're monitoring people at DEF CON to see that they're visiting what sites. Like, I mean, it's limited.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I just that was like kind of what popped into my head when I was reading it, was like conferences or maybe like coffee shops or something like that, those types of situations. And so we were talking about TLS and how strong it is, and Google actually gave an update on Android TLS adoption. So this talks about TLS being adopted at the app level. So they talk about how in Android 7, API 24, they introduced network security configuration. And that basically allowed people to set network policies on the apps. And then in Android Pie, which is 9, they set a default policy that prevents unencrypted traffic. And so they gave out some statistics on, how many apps are using, are encrypting traffic. So they said today, 80% of apps are encrypting traffic by default, and that's including Android 7 and Android 8, I think. If you only include Android 9 and higher, it's 90% are encrypted by default.
Yeah, and I mean, I like seeing this stat because the use of crypto, like the use of TLS, has been, there's a real struggle to get companies to actually encrypt their data for quite a while. I mean, I'm talking closer to 2010 or so. Like around that time, there's still kind of a fight to get things using it. So I mean, to see Google kind of pushing for that, they've pushed for it in the past. Like it's not new for them to push for, general security. But I mean, I'm definitely happy to kind of see this type of increasing the apps actually using it. Getting up, as it says, they're up to 90%. So I mean, that's kind of why I want to bring this up there. Like, I think it's awesome to see it being adopted because that little step of just having encryption makes a huge difference in practice.
Yeah, I mean, one question I do kind of have, though, is they said that Android 9 and later they have a default policy that prevents unencrypted traffic, but they say there's still 10% of them that are not encrypting traffic by default. So they disabled.
Well, either that,
like, why would you want to do that? I'm just trying to think of
so
why.
One of the big reasons has always been that TLS is simply a heavy load on the server. So you have a lot of clients and the data isn't sensitive. Companies will decide, well, okay, let's just not even bother with using TLS. Maybe they'll do something else like sign it or something, like having static data that just gets signed to kind of confirm it's legitimate. Which kind of still deals with some of the issues. Doesn't deal with tampering or like man in the middle. But yeah, the big thing has always, or at least the biggest argument I tended to hear, was the just performance issues, performance concerns when you have a ton of people hitting this endpoint, needing to do decryption on all of them. I think it's less of an issue now. One, hardware's gotten faster. I want to say, with HTTP 2, we've seen some performance increases there also. But yeah, I think the big thing is really just performance.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not like 90% is really good. I think that's awesome. It's just that when they mention that they do it by default, I actually expected it to be a bit higher. I didn't expect 10% of them to, do that trade-off for performance or anything like that. But yeah,
so the other thing can be that they're using like by default, there's like the defaults in that application are using this here option, but they allow, say users to enter their own, which can then disable it. So they have in their kind of system settings that they allow the unencrypted connection because users can specify their own. So just because there's that 10%, it doesn't necessarily mean that that 10% is choosing to go unencrypted. It just means that they're choosing to allow unencrypted. So, I mean, it very well can be that a lot of them are actually going unencrypted, but it can also be just, we need to allow the option because some of our clients are, say, going to use a self-signed certificate or something of that nature. And so they need to have that option within the application.
Okay. Yeah, I never really thought about that. Okay. That's a good point. But yeah, so we'll move on to some browser stuff with Mozilla and Opera removing Avast extensions from the add-on stores.
Before we get there, can I just really quickly touch on what my AOCAT had asked?
Yeah, so do you want to address that now or towards the end? Because I
figure it came up in chat now, might as well address it now.
Okay, fair enough.
And I mean, I don't have much to say, but the question, they've linked a CV here. Asking, how would you go and learn how it works? I tried to read cover to cover, but it seems complex. And I'm just going to pull up the CV on stream.
I've seen this one before. I haven't really looked at it too much, but I've definitely seen it.
Yeah, I don't think what we're not going to do right now is give you a rundown of how it works, especially if you're saying it looks complex. Really quick look over at it here. Not something that I'm going to be able to give up. But in terms of just how to start approaching it, the biggest thing, and this is kind of a phrase I like to quote, but a frustration is a key part of vulnerability research. You end up spending a lot of time frustrated, a lot of time doing research into something, banging your head against the wall, and then, a week later, you kind of get that crack that you start banging your head against instead of just the wall in general. That's how a lot of this goes. A lot of times it's just taking a lot of time, sitting down. If you don't understand this, you go back and you try and, you Google some of the keywords and try and make sure you understand kind of the background, the foundation. And it's just, being willing to invest a lot of time. It is totally okay and normal to need to spend, hours and hours and days just doing research.
Especially when you're talking about something like the kernel too. It's such a monolith,
Yeah, but just as an example, when I was doing assessments professionally, we would have this, we'd call it buffer time, where we'd kind of have a normal project. Project goes for 2-3 weeks or whatever, focus on one application. But then we'd have some time between that where we're expected to kind of get up to speed on our next thing. We're spending, about a week just reading about whatever tech stack's being used by our next project. Just doing a ton of that research kind of upfront. So even in the professional realm, spending a lot of time doing research is key. Once you get a lot of that background, things become easier. But yeah, in terms of just how to approach some CV that you want to look at, the big thing is just take your time. Don't worry about the fact that it's going to take you a while, but just take your time and do the research. Because another phrase that I'll bring up is time spent in reconnaissance is seldom wasted. Obviously, that has a bit more of a military context, but I think it applies to the vulnerability research. Spend that time doing research, even if it doesn't necessarily apply right now. In the future, you never know where those little tidbits that you pick up randomly are going to help out. And you build up this wide breadth of knowledge through that.
I mean, one tool that might be worth looking at for doing some of that reconnaissance on this specific issue is a tool called ftrace. I think it's ftrace. And what that basically allows you to do is it allows you to get a trace of every function that's called in the kernel. So when the context switch happens, you can see which functions are getting called in your program. And that can be very useful for trying to do some flow analysis to find where the bug is and try to understand it better from their POC. So that is one thing I'll say is ftrace can be helpful for that. But yeah, you gotta run it and then play around with it. Use something like ftrace or maybe a kernel debugger, and just try to figure out what's happening and why it's happening.
So
and
you
just gotta break it down.
ftrace or strace?
I think it's ftrace.
Okay,
strace
I'm familiar
I think
with
is for syscalls.
Yeah, strace is syscalls.
Yeah, so strace will give you a base level view of what syscalls and stuff that your program is making, but ftrace will actually give you the functions in the kernel that are being called past the syscall level. So that's why it's more useful, I think. for exploit stuff when you're talking about kernel. All right.
Yeah. So hopefully that helped.
Yeah. So we'll go back to our extension talk. So Mozilla and Opera have removed the Avast extensions. Google hasn't, at least yet. They didn't yesterday. I don't know if they have today. I doubt it.
Yeah, it looked this morning. Looked like it was still there, and I also looked, and it wasn't on Mozilla yet, so it hasn't been returned.
Okay. So yeah, like this extension, it seems very invasive in what they collect. They mentioned that it collects all the sites you visit, who referred you to them, whether you visited the page before, browser and OS information, how you got there, like if you got there through a Google search or a link click from somewhere else. It's like
window tab number,
yeah,
things like that. There is a lot of information we collect here, and basically this is the Avast like safe browser stuff. And the key issue here, or part of this, so it was actually reported on back at the end of October. The same person has their blog post. I've just pulled that up, which kind of goes into the details about what Avast is collecting. What kind of changed and why we're just seeing some action from Mozilla and stuff now is he just reported it quite recently to Mozilla because he looked at this service called JumpShot from Avast, or that was acquired by Avast. And what that offers is, or what they say they offer, is this incredibly detailed clickstream data from 100 million global online shoppers. And the other product here is Avast, I want to say Safe Shop. There's
Safe Price?
They have a shopping app. So anyway, this JumpShot gives clickstream data from 100 million global online shoppers and 20 million global app users for you to analyze however you want, track what users search for, how they interacted with a particular brand or product, what they bought, look into any category, country, or domain. Which sounds like, as they point out here, exactly what Avast is collecting. So essentially, Avast is tracking everything that you're doing in your browser and then sending it off for people to look at. So they know that was like as a commercial service. So yeah, they reported to Mozilla, Opera, and Google, and they basically Mozilla and Opera removed it. Google hasn't done anything about it.
Yeah, so they mentioned both Google and Mozilla, like that's a violation of the developer TOS. And Mozilla, I'm not surprised that they acted on it fairly quickly. Mozilla is very privacy-centric. We've talked about it before. Google, on the other hand, again, I'm not surprised that they don't even really seem to care because Google's had a disregard for privacy for a while. And that too, yeah. Google doesn't really have a good contact point for anything. So, yeah, I mean, they said they used the report feature, but... You know, Google's one of those companies where you don't even know if...
I'd have to imagine the report feature isn't actually hitting anybody until, you know, maybe multiple reports or until like
probably
something
have to hit
happens.
A threshold. Yeah.
Yeah, like I imagine there's more than just the threshold. Like I imagine they've got to have some sort of little AI system that triages these reports to decide what to actually send forward. So yeah, I can't imagine a human's actually going to see it until... or unless this actually kind of gets some attention from, you know, on Twitter or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking too, was I was wondering if this report, once it kind of, you know, got bigger or anything, if that would kind of force Google into making a change. But I don't know, because, I mean, Google's done other things with Chrome that I think we've talked about before that are kind of privacy invasive, and, you know, there were uproars about it. And
yeah, but I mean, Google doesn't want somebody competing with them.
Hey, that's true. So, you know, maybe we'll see something done. But I don't know, man. I was a Chrome user for a while. Chrome was my daily driver for years, and I've switched. I'm back on Firefox because, especially when we're yeah, welcome back. Because Chrome is like, with the privacy stuff plus their recent, you know, attempt to try to kill ad blockers, it's like I'll just go back to Firefox, dude.
Yeah, like, I mean, for me, I mean, I've been a Firefox user at least since 1.5. I think I might have been on 1.0. But I remember distinctly 1.5. And I moved off a little bit when Netflix wasn't working, which was some Widevine related stuff. But I mean, for me, my biggest thing against Google is that they already see my search. Like, Google is still my main search engine. I have been using DuckDuckGo more, but I just Firefox has kind of been the one that's kind of been there, and Google, they know everything about my searches already. They don't need to know my browsing habits too. That said, going with Avast, I actually was an Avast user for a little while. Okay. Yeah, I used it for a little bit. I want to say maybe half a year to a year, which I think would have been maybe around when it was a while ago. Like 2012 or so.
I actually want to say that I tried Avast before, or rather AVG or whatever it is, and it was so unoptimized. I bought a new laptop, right, and I think it had AVG on it or something. I don't remember, or I put AVG on it, whatever it was.
They started doing some weird stuff, like just even having like these voice alerts and stuff that would come up and say. I don't remember what they would say anymore, but I remember them having like those little things, like just those little like, hey, I'm still here, those nagware type things. I guess it wasn't nagging you to buy. Well, it kind of was, because I was on the free version, but I just remember some of those things and being like, you know what, screw this, I'll go to something else.
Yeah, I mean, it slowed my computer, my brand new laptop, down so badly that I had to uninstall it. It was garbage, and I never touched Avast after that.
Yeah, so fair enough. I could believe it. I mean, it seems like, we had kind of the Norton and McAfee antivirus war in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then we kind of had the same thing happen with the feature wars of a lot of those free antiviruses, more around like during this last decade. So like, I could definitely see what you're saying about the performance going downhill. Like, I think it was just history repeating itself, but with the new generation of the antiviruses.
Yeah. Just jumping back a little bit on the browser stuff. Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I'm not happy with the direction that Chrome was going, so that's why I switched. With antiviruses, though, I mean, I want to say, like, you were kind of talking about the history there of, like, it being used in the 90s and the last 10 years or so. Windows Defender has gotten pretty good. And it makes me wonder if, like, some of these antiviruses, especially like AVG and stuff, I think people should just start ditching them, honestly. I don't know what your thoughts are around that, but...
No, I mean, I more or less agree. So I use, like, Windows Defender is kind of my main driver. I also have Malwarebytes. Although even that has become very naggy. That said, like, no, I mean, Windows Defender has absolutely gotten better. And I think the reality is, like, I think most of them are generally going to be the same. You're going to have like some very specialized issues where, are they going to catch the latest, never before seen malware? Probably not. I mean, yeah, there's some behavioral stuff they can do. Like, there's detections that can maybe catch it. Realistically, that's also not your biggest threat. Your biggest threat is generally going to be older malware that's kind of... See, a real nano user asks, what's the purpose of antivirus nowadays? And, the reality is antivirus is there to catch, so it's... We've thought about doing kind of like a separate video pretty much just about this topic. I think there is some room for discussion. I do think antivirus still have a purpose. Just because it's there to kind of protect when you're randomly browsing the web and, malvertising. Now, somebody might say, oh, well, it's so easy to get around the antivirus. And sure, right now, I mean, it's pretty reasonable to create a malicious executable that won't be detected by an antivirus. It's a lot harder to do that when you're also going to try and infect, tens of thousands of users. The antiviruses are still kind of there to protect. And I kind of go back to, for me, there's just kind of one moment I was... Like, I'm generally fairly tech savvy. I'm not just, running all the executables I find. I'm not downloading all the cheats off the internet. So also Real Now mentions, I thought web-related stuff was best handled by uBlock and uMatrix. And I agree, like, those are a good stage for it. No, I wouldn't quite classify, also mentions, though I'm not sure if that's classified as antivirus. I wouldn't classify that as an antivirus. I generally think of an antivirus as it being a later stage of defense. Once something has gotten through uBlock or something like that, once it's gotten through there, gotten to the point of actually having an executable, like having actually compromised your system. So there's a lot of layers that are going to prevent it. Having updated software, for example, will kind of prevent a lot of it. Using uBlock, so you're not having just the random JavaScripts running or malicious domains running. But in a sense, those that like uBlock will, because it works on those lists, will actually be kind of similar to how the antiviruses will do the blocking. They'll block that same sort of connection. So there's definitely some similarity, but it's kind of just, I'd say it's a later stage of defense. And that's the thing, it's just one more layer of defense if something manages to get through all of that. And so the thing for me that kind of hit home for me was I used to read cracked.com had random humor articles. While I was working, I'd randomly go visit, and they were compromised by malvertising thing. And I remember thinking, like, I wasn't hit by that one. Usually with these malvertising campaigns, they're not going to try and infect absolutely every visitor. It's going to run on, say, 1 in 100 visitors to try and stay a little bit more stealthy, but still get a lot of infection. But I very easily could have, and at that time, I'd kind of thought, oh, well, antivirus isn't necessary. I'd kind of started to fall into that camp, and then kind of realized I pretty easily could have found myself in a situation where I was infected just because, I wasn't running the antivirus.
Yeah, so basically, like, it's kind of a good protection to have, but it's not going to prevent against, like, targeted attacks or anything. It's more for those widespread, massive noisy issues kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's just another layer of defense. Because a lot of these things, like even like Windows Defender actually adds in just exploit mitigations also. It's not just doing like the and the same with like Malwarebytes, a lot of the antiviruses now. They don't just do like virus detection. They're also going to do certain little mitigations, like they're going to maybe add in some control flow integrity checks, just kind of like everything running. They're going to do little things that make the exploits harder to pull off.
Yeah, which, like you're saying, is definitely a value. But yeah, I mean,
targeted though, like it's not necessarily going to help. And like I said, we've thought about kind of doing a full video just on this topic because it is a common sentiment that antiviruses aren't needed. Personally, I do think that people should still have it just as that layer of defense, but I get why people kind of think it's so easy to get around. And quite frankly, they are.
That being said, I don't want to say antiviruses are useless, but I want to say that those browser extensions, like this Avast browser extension, those you don't need. Like, just use uBlock or something like that.
Yeah, okay.
Don't bother with these AV extensions.
Yeah, for a moment, I thought you were about to say that the extensions like uBlock weren't necessary, and I was definitely about to jump in there. Yeah, so I will say that I think the extensions like uBlock are more important. Like, if you're only going to have one, have those extensions, because that's kind of a frontline defense that's actively updated and community updated. Whereas usually the antiviruses are a little bit more, a little bit slower, and like I said, kind of take place later on. At least having that frontline defense, I think, is a little bit more important, but I could probably be swayed against that if somebody were to actually present an argument. I haven't really thought about that too much, actually.
Just overall, like, I just want to say in closing before we move on that, those browser extensions, I don't like them. And I think there's probably more than just Avast doing this, honestly.
Well, so the one that I would point out, Honey.
Honey?
I mean, I haven't heard of it. So Honey sponsors a lot of YouTubers. Because what they offer is you download Honey. And I don't know, maybe they can sponsor us, maybe not after I say this, but what it basically is you kind of run their app. When you go to checkout on a store, it'll be like, hey, we know about coupon codes for this store. Do you want us to try all of these coupon codes that we know of and see if we can get you a deal? So as a user,
I've heard of that.
It is pretty useful. That's a useful feature. They also, I think, do some price tracking. but they're a free application. So just to be really clear, I have no first-hand knowledge confirming that they actually track and resell this information. That said, they're a free extension that offer discounts to people. I don't see how they're profiting, and especially profiting enough to then sponsor YouTube videos from, some fairly large channels. The place I think I first saw it on was Linus Tech Tips. I don't see how they're doing that without selling that information. The only other place I could really see them monetizing it is making deals with various companies, being like, yeah, well, you give us a coupon code for our Honey users, and they get a kickback on that, and I'm pretty sure they do that also. But I can't imagine that being enough to actually pay off like everything. I have to imagine that's going to, one of their big things is going to be selling that shopping information.
Yeah. I mean, overall, I just I don't trust a lot of those browser extensions, and hopefully that blog post might discourage people from using those antivirus garbage extensions, because like I said, there's probably more than just that even in terms of antivirus ones that are doing it. So yeah, I thought it was a cool post just to highlight that issue, give it some traction.
Yeah, it definitely brings tension because there are other ways to do this. So some of those antivirus ones don't need to send everything off. I think they talk about either in this post or in their previous post. Must be their previous one where they talk about how Mozilla. So like Google's had like the safe browsing list for a long time, like early 2000s. And what that does is basically downloads a list to your computer, and then whenever you visit a site, the browser just checks it against that list to see if it's malicious. So at no point is Google or whoever has this or whoever's maintaining this list getting to know what sites you're visiting. It's all happening kind of internal and locally. That's how this can be done in a more secure way. And that's how other antivirus extensions have done this. They haven't shared all the information out to like their parent website or to like the parent company. They've kept it all local. They've downloaded the blacklisted domains from the antivirus website and done these checks locally. That's how this can be done in an appropriate way.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, we'll move on from there.
Okay, so I do want to mention Real Nano User mentions that Honey, but the way they make money, and conversely saying they don't sell user info at all, is through affiliate kickback. So if that's the case, like I said, I did want to make it clear that I was purely speculating. It is possible that they are just doing it through the kickbacks. And if that's the case, like that's, a lot better. Like I said, I was purely speculating on how Honey may be working because it definitely seemed odd to me that a company would be working on, or would be to make that much just on kickbacks. That does surprise me, but if they are saying like they don't sell user information, I could believe that too. So, I mean, do your own research. I don't want to, cause anybody just to go and uninstall it needlessly because it does seem like it can bring you some value. But yeah, moving on, kind of our next topic here, which has already been brought up, is Tron Evolution. SecuROM DRM expiration makes game unplayable 9 years after release.
This Another is, potentially controversial topic.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that's it's kind of security tangent or adjacent, kind of what we should be talking about. It hits home with me. For those of you who aren't aware, I run a kind of we've called it a revival server for PS2 and PS3 game that shut down some years ago. We kind of rebuilt the server and then now we run it. Basically, DRM kind of prevented us from being able to play those games. So it just hurts whenever I see another game going down like this. For me, it was Sony's DNAS that kind of prevented us from playing on the PS2, but in this case, looks like it, and it's as simple as they didn't renew their contract with the DRM, so DRM's just like, nope, you can't play anymore.
Awesome. I will say, SecuROM, specifically when you read it out. I didn't notice it when I first read it, but when you like said it aloud, it reminded me that somebody actually posted when I posted about QWERTY's talk about hitting SecuROM for iOS on NetSec. When they read the title, some people actually thought we were talking about this with SecuROM.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, so I thought I'd just highlight that because I just remembered that. Yeah, so I mean, Disney didn't renew the activation system for it, and one thing that I saw people were kind of upset about it for was the speedrunning community. Apparently, there's a speedrunning community that's been built up around this game, and people don't really want to crack the game to do speedrunning. Once that happens, they're kind of like, yeah, I just won't bother anymore. And that was the big kind of community that died from that. Just spawning off of what you were saying, where how DRM can kind of mess with things later on in the game's life or after end of life. So yeah, speedrunning was the big thing. I mean, I really don't understand why, when you have these expirations, why it just doesn't become free software at that point. Like, I think that would be a much better way to handle it. Honestly, you're not making money off this game 9 years later anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, a lot of times when companies are doing the DRM, they're looking at about 3 months. They want to keep the game from being cracked for 3 months. That's, the focus with a lot of them is that 3-month target. I mean, obviously, though, you do get the long tail on some games where people keep buying in. On stream, I actually just pulled up to see how active the speedrunning community was for that. Oh, no, I see things coming out like 6 months ago. I don't see too many new entries. One here from a month ago on the game, but...
Okay, fair enough.
So maybe... I mean, it could be more active elsewhere. I just pulled it up on speedrun.com.
Okay.
There could be another community that they're more active on. But still, I mean, when it comes to this software, I would love to see companies be a bit more proactive in trying to allow their games to stay online after they no longer maintain it. Obviously, though, it is kind of their right, I guess, to not do that. But, like, I agree. Like, once a company is like, okay, we're no longer maintaining this, I wish it was easier for them to be like, and, here's code to run the server. I don't think that's ever really going to happen because, the code they're using to run the server is going to be a lot more complicated than what most people are going to want or need. But even things like LAN play, if you had LAN play, then you could use something like, a VPN to kind of continue having online play and just pretending that you're in a LAN.
Yeah, I mean, but even with this issue, like, just the DRM itself, like,
yeah, this makes the game unplayable just entirely. Completely. It's not even just online, which is kind of another issue there of having like this sort of online, constantly connected. Like, I don't know how this one actually works. But as a DRM system, like that, it kind of ties in, I think, to just having a single player game that you need to be connected online for to kind of have that constant connection with. It makes sense in terms of defending the game, but I do wish it was more acceptable for companies to just open up their software, or open up their things rather than closing them down. Yeah, even if the community's not large, it's still, there's always those few people that would just like to keep going.
Yeah, I mean, one thing though is you could consider it unreasonable for companies to even revisit games that are that old, so
I don't think they should need to have to maintain it that long.
No, not maintain it, but even just going back to do kind of the things that you're saying, I think people can, or you can see the perspective that it's like, well, the game's, not supported at all anymore. We're not going to touch it, It's kind of weird. Like you said, it's very much the prerogative of the company. It's just, yeah, it would be very nice if like DRM and stuff, after it's expired or the infrastructure for the DRM has been phased out, just make the game free, honestly. Like, I mean, to be fair, people will crack it, and they're not going to care if people crack it. So it kind of is free in that sense. It's just
I'll say this: Disney isn't going to do that. Disney, they still want to hold their copyright on Mickey Mouse from the 20s.
Yeah,
Disney's kind of the holder of that infinite copyright. So, and Tron is owned by Disney,
which I actually didn't know. Today I learned. But yeah. So we'll talk about some compromises. So there was this report from on VPN Mentor that millions of Americans at risk after huge data and SMS leak. So this was pretty big. There was a breached database that apparently belonged to True Dialogue, which is it's a communications company. Apparently they work with a lot of telecom companies. And there were like millions of usernames, passwords, and PII that was kind of released there, personal identifying information. So it was kind of a treasure trove for that. And there was even some text conversations that were leaked. But I will say, one thing that's not immediately obvious is these are business to customer, not customer to customer. So the kind of text conversations that were leaked probably aren't as sensitive.
No, but it does include things like, a password email, for example, or a password message. And one thing I want to point out, this is I'm pretty sure they don't explicitly say this, but if you look at kind of what this data kind of looks like, it looks like a MongoDB.
Looks like another
exposed MongoDB.
Yep.
Just because this looks like, what you'd see with a Mongo document. It's possible it's something else, but given the history that what we've seen with Mongo in the past, I wouldn't be surprised to find out that this is Mongo, which uses this sort of JSON document storage format.
I want to say this is the year of exposed MongoDBs. We've had so many.
There's been plenty of them. So
I feel like there's been more this year than I've heard of in the past. Maybe it's just because we weren't really looking for it last year, or I wasn't really keeping up with it as much last year. But I've heard about way more of them this year than ever before.
I'd probably just put it on the fact that we're looking at it
that's fair.
With the podcast here.
But still, it's a lot.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. Like I said, they don't state that specifically, so I could be wrong about that. But yeah, you kind of see here the type of information in there, full names, business to customer messages, but still, they have examples there of passwords and phone number. Well, phone numbers are kind of a given, but of confirmed password in there. So definitely still some sensitive information that you can use. And obviously this information would be useful for phishing, doing some specific spear phishing.
Yeah, and I think one of the other interesting ones on the company end is they mentioned corporate espionage. So using the content of the messages from the leaked database to, using that to seem more legitimate in a way.
Yeah, so, that would help with. That kind of comes down to the spear phishing too. Is you're able to tailor your information a lot more.
Yeah. So, it is a pretty big breach. But I think they should have made that a bit more apparent in their thing that it was business to customer, because that wasn't immediately obvious. It took me reading a little bit before I found that, because I was thinking at the top that it was more of the customer to customer stuff. In that case, this would be a lot worse, ridiculously worse. So I just wish they made that a little bit more apparent, but.
Usually, you find out it's or when they mention that it's a specific piece of software that's leaking this and stuff, it kind of makes sense that it's not customer to customer. Yeah. But maybe that was just my assumption kind of going into it.
Yeah. So there was another rogue employee incident with Nebraska Medicine. Nebraska Medicine was breached by a rogue employee. So
yeah, they say breached. And this was some very sensitive information, medical information, including things like physician notes, reports out of that, obviously, and any sort of clinical information was compromised through this. And reading the headline, it mentions here social security numbers and more. Reading the headlines, basically all this was a member of staff basically accessed patients outside of their responsibility. Yeah, it says here the employee had accessed patient records outside of the employee's job responsibilities. The employee was terminated the next day. So this doesn't seem like it's a massive breach of Nebraska medicine. It doesn't seem like they were necessarily trying to sell, the entire database of medical information or something.
No, and I do wonder, like, they have these dates, right? So they say the unauthorized access occurred between July 11th of 2018 and October 1st of 2019. And I kind of want to see how they get those dates, because they say that they found it in an audit on October 1st, so that one makes sense. But where does the 2018 one come from? Is that when he was hired, or is that when...
Yeah, they definitely don't say. They just say it was between that. My guess would be not necessarily when they were hired, but when they... it could have just been the first time they decided to kind of stretch it and go look for whatever reason. Maybe, they looked up a girlfriend's record or something. I don't know. I'm making that up.
It seems like it could be a very small issue that's been blown up a little bit to sound more impactful than it actually is.
That's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah, so what's the word I'm looking for? It seems kind of sensationalized. That's what I was thinking of. It could have just been like a very trivial, like, something like you're saying, like accessed one person instead of like, hundreds or thousands of people or anything.
Yeah,
like
they don't give us numbers for how many people were accessed. But unless and I imagine they would, if they said something like, oh, they accessed like thousands, I imagine that would be news. So I have to feel like this is a pretty small number.
Yeah. So next we have a pretty funny story. Practical Pentest Labs. So obviously when you're like, this seems to be like a small company that deals with pen testing and providing like, learning and stuff in that area. And it was discovered that they were storing passwords in plain text because somebody had lost their password, and they used the forgot my password, and they got sent their plain text password in an email. And so they got called out for it, as they should. And then they made a response that was probably even worse. Just kind of poured gasoline on the fire. They were like, we don't allow users to pick passwords because we make them randomly generated so that we can email people their passwords when they forget it. And it's like, I don't understand, like, how you can be like a pen test company and allow, like, think that's a good stance to have.
So I don't see this as being as bad as it's been blown up to be. So first of all, I'll preface that by saying, they should have an actual account system in place, but that's kind of the issue here. If we were to change this around, instead of saying storing passwords in plain text, what if we turn this around and said they're storing API access tokens in plain text? Suddenly it doesn't sound so bad, which is effectively what these tokens were. They weren't user-generated tokens. It wasn't something that you could personally change. They could change them. You could email them and have it changed, but it wasn't something you could personally change. It was a token pair, so you had your username and your token that you could use to access their labs. So it was credentials in that sense, but I mean, if we turn it around to say, API access token being, left out in plain text, obviously they shouldn't be emailing it. There's one issue right there. But the idea of storing it in plain text, it doesn't seem as bad because a lot of places don't go and encrypt their access tokens. You can see that plainly. So while, I mean, it's unlikely that a user is going to... So one of the big issues is, website X gets compromised, so then you could use those same credentials on, A, B, and C. Well, they're generating the password, so that password probably isn't going to be reused on A, B, and C if it was, website X that even generated it in the first place. Not to say it couldn't be. Somebody goes to the hassle of actually memorizing this password, odds are they're going to think, well, I've memorized this strong password and maybe go ahead and reuse it elsewhere. So like there is the potential for the reuse, but it's lower. And that's kind of where they're coming from with this. This is basically an access token tied with a username, but they're treating it a lot differently from credentials. They don't have like a panel you can log in, do any billing stuff. Like there's no real account stuff here. It's just that token that you get. So sending it in plain text over email is just, poor move for their own security. But in terms of like somebody popping their database, all you're getting is access to all of those accounts, but you already have access to everything because you have like their database or you have all of that already. So it wouldn't really be help just because you had the password. Now, with that said, I do want to be clear. As a pen test company, like this is not appropriate in any way. I just wanted to spend some time kind of in their defense with downplaying it. It's definitely not an appropriate move. Like this is just kind of trying to reinvent the box and have this alternative system without really understanding why we've got the system, why we have kind of the process that we do. What they should do, if they for some reason their labs actually needed this kind of accessible token value, and just in response to Mr. Gate, I use a vault to store all my passwords and tokens. But do the services that you visit store the tokens in some encrypted or hashed form is more what I'm getting at. Not so much your own storage of those.
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of agree with you in that plaintext passwords in this instance are not as big of an issue as when you can choose your passwords because of the lower risk of password reuse. But I mean, I find it questionable the way they expect you to use a randomized password that they generate. I mean, obviously, if you have something like a password manager, that's not a big issue. You just add it to the password manager. But not everyone does. And I think people who don't use password managers, the way they're probably going to use a system like this is they're going to physically write the password down somewhere on like a sticky note. Which,
yeah, so here's the thing.
That's where I have an issue with it, is it's encouraging some bad practices in that regard.
I agree there. But here's the thing, like just in general, they should have a proper account system. Let people send email, set a password, log in, and if they need, like, if for some reason, like how their labs are architected or whatever, they need this token, like that needs to be how they do this for whatever reason. If that's what they need, token. Yeah, they could have a token that's attached to the account, but that token is just displayed like on a panel you log into. Don't email it out there. Don't because email is plain text. It's going to be, somebody can read that, either the email host, somebody in transit, whatever. It's accessible. So what I'd say is, just do a proper account system and have a token there. If they really need the token, that's the way to do it. Follow kind of the proper way. This is just kind of like either being as generous as I can. They're just trying to reinvent the box and do something a little bit new. And I mean, there's room for playing around, but I wouldn't do it on like an information security site that's like, teaching people best practices. It just seems like the wrong place.
Yeah, it's kind of antithetical to what it is.
Yeah, like, I mean, you might remember years ago when I was trying to develop my own form system, I was playing around with I won't say insecure, but an alternative password storage method. That I just used kind of like a pet project to do that. I didn't try and, push that into, I was working as a developer at the time. I didn't try and push that into our actual product.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, that's a good point that you brought up. It is being overblown a little bit with how
plain text passwords get overblown. There's so many times, like one of my little pet peeves is seeing people mention, oh, this website's storing passwords in plain text because they were able to email me my password during registration. And they very well might be storing it in plain text, but the fact that they could email it to you during registration doesn't indicate that at all. But yet they'll get blown up over that. And again, I don't think they should be emailing it. I'm not trying to defend that. But I think a lot of people don't completely understand the implications of everything. And then they just make the assumption that everything's on fire, everything's bad. when it's not as bad as it might appear.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, so this, I feel like it kind of has been blown up a good bit. There's definitely some issues here, and there's questions. If they're cutting these corners, what else are they cutting? But their side, like, if you change the phrasing a little bit, like, so just think about it as a token, it seems a little bit different now.
Yeah. So there was a incident report on HackerOne that has a pretty big bounty tied to it, $20,000, and it was an account takeover through through a disclosed session cookie. So basically, this guy who wrote the incident report, he was able to access HackerOne security analyst's account by disclosed session cookie. And this, when I looked into it, it seemed to be because he was doing something in some other report, and I think he put the output of a curl command or something like that, and that ended up leaking a cookie through the logging. And because of that, they were able to steal the cookie and use that to hijack the session. So he actually got a $20,000 payout for this report, which is pretty crazy. I thought that was quite a lot.
Yeah, and it's a very simple issue, but I think just the fact that he happened to be the one that had the actual compromise, like, he did legitimately compromise HackerOne. He did access that security analyst thing. Obviously, he reported that immediately, and you can see in kind of the questioning afterwards, asking about what he had access to, and what he tried to access. And yeah, there's kind of the questions down here. Are there things outside screenshots that you looked at, like trying to figure out what he did? Like, they did full incident response to this.
Yeah.
So that's a big reason for the bounty. Is less, like, I imagine if you just reported this as its own issue. Actually, I imagine if you reported this, a lot of companies don't like to take this sort of session hijacking too seriously anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about previously. We've talked about session hijacking and the actual risks involved with that. But this is they had an actual incident, so I think that obviously bumped it up quite a bit. The gist fake, you copy his cookie, put it into your own browser, and now you've got access to run everything as that user. So simple. And actually, for their solution here, all they did is they basically tied the session to a specific IP.
Yeah, that was the big thing that came out of it, was the tying of that. So
yeah, which probably works for them, but it doesn't really work. It doesn't work in a lot of cases. There are a lot of cases if your users are like behind a corporate proxy or just on their phone, then they might change IPs kind of in the process of using it and shouldn't necessarily need to sign in again. So that isn't a solution for everybody, but obviously that works for them when it comes to their employees. Like, they're able to make that decision, but that's not it is a solution, but it's not a universal solution.
yeah, I mean, to be fair, I can't really think of what else they could really do. Like, could you think of anything else they could really do that would be better than tying the IP to it?
There are some options. So browser fingerprinting would be one. Kind of just using a fingerprint of that. And kind of the issue comes down to, well, how do you share that fingerprint in a way that can't be cloned, though? There are questions with that. People have done things like tying it to the user agent. Just basically before any sensitive action requiring a password to be entered. Requiring 2FA is another thing, like having that secondary authentication mid-app, like before doing any sort of sensitive action. That wouldn't really work in this case for like just viewing security analyst report. Like, so that was one of the things. They had access to all these reports. I wasn't imagining to enter your password to view every report. That would be a bit much. Yeah, that would be unreasonable. So yeah, it's a hard problem. So where a lot of the defense comes in is in trying to protect that cookie itself. That cookie should have things like HTTP only flag, should have the secure flag, so it's not sent over like an HTTP. It needs to be over HTTPS. Should be properly restricted, so it's not sent to any inappropriate domains or subdomains. The path. Like, there's a lot of those little things that add extra layers to protect that cookie. But with the current setup where people can change their IPs very frequently, there isn't a lot you can do to just lock down the session itself to a specific system. Like, there are some soft things you can do, like I mentioned, browser fingerprinting, or even just looking at the user agent if the user agent changes. Obviously, session expiration. So if they haven't made any requests in the last hour, just have it shouldn't be valid anymore. Like having a shorter expiration on that. I mean, it shouldn't be able to come. I do think I don't think people should be able to just come back the next day all the time. Like, it really depends on how sensitive the content is. Like, something like this, I feel like asking them to log in once a day and kind of be active during the day isn't too much.
I mean, one thing with the IPs, though, compared to, like, you were talking about browser fingerprinting or user agent, it is a lot easier to spoof a user agent than it is, like, if it's tied to an IP.
Oh, yeah, no, user agent is not a solution. User agent is just kind of a little layer of something to detect, like, hey, something seems a little bit wrong here. Mr. Gabe mentions tied it to user agent and client time zone. Again, like, somebody could spoof these things. It's just that little layer of defense. If you know it's there, then it doesn't do very much.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's the thing. It's just these little things. And that's true with even the fingerprinting, because you need to send that fingerprint. There needs to be some way for it to do that detection, which means there's something that somebody could just kind of fake it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think kind of really the best practice would just be having a shorter timeout on it. And obviously, like, you can have, in terms of corporations, you can do things to kind of try and prevent people from being able to share that information out there, but...
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was kind of wondering is maybe in their report system they could have something that does, like, even something simple like a regex or something to try to find, like, the cookie values, like, just looking for the cookie name and then looking for a format that would indicate that cookie's being leaked.
I think it sounds like they might have done something like that, but yeah, that's kind of exactly what I'm referring to. Is just having that in general. Like, I mean, because companies will have that for trying to detect sensitive information being shared outside of the company, like somebody trying to leak information. Like, that sort of thing already exists. But yeah, as Mr. Gay kind of mentions, he's mentioning something he's implemented there. For example, if just the user agent changed, the cookie would become invalid. But if the client time zone for the cookie changed, I would flag it for review, as that is more serious. And I mean, that's kind of thing. Like, these are soft checks that you can do that add layers of defense to protect that cookie, but they don't just flat out prevent any sort of hijacking attack. What you can kind of do is detect, and I think have those layers before the sensitive information. Like I mentioned, doing that extra authentication when you want to access the admin panel or like some sensitive area, or you just need to enter a 2FA code or something like that. But generally, a lot of the protections are these softer things.
Yeah. So looking
at... I'm glad that they paid out fairly well for this. Encouraging people who notice these things to actually come forward with it.
Yeah, that was the most surprising, was the 20,000. That's pretty cool. So,
I'm sure this guy was glad for it.
Yeah, definitely. So let's look at Wide-OpenBSD, a headliner that we have. So we've talked about OpenBSD before. OpenBSD, so basically the BSD family, there's three major operating systems. You have FreeBSD, OpenBSD, and NetBSD. In terms of security, FreeBSD is kind of in the middle. NetBSD is the worst because it supports a lot of legacy code, and because of that, there's a lot more low-hanging fruit and stuff like that. OpenBSD is kind of considered more of the top end of security. They're a lot quicker to implement mitigations, fix bugs, remove old code. In terms of, like, the code base for the kernel, they're pretty good with security generally. But the problem with OpenBSD is, while they're focusing on those, lower level issues, they have higher level issues like what we're going to talk about right now that kind of make them pointless in a way. Because there's a list of CVEs here in the security advisory that are in that are authentication bypasses in like things like SSHD and stuff like that, like pretty like daemons that are used like SMTP quite a bit.
No, I don't think they actually. So they do case studies of this one auth bypass in SSH and in like
yeah,
SM,
sorry,
but
it's
they don't
bug.
have. They didn't like it. Didn't work in SSH. It didn't work in LDAP. It didn't work in SU.
Oh, I thought. Wait,
Well,
are you sure?
So
SSH?
the issue worked, but it would crash on as a null dereference in a lot of these.
Oh, right. Okay.
So I guess let's get into what the actual issue is here. And I think the issue is kind of fun. Basically, when you do these logins, it'll call this login style binary. And with that login style binary, they'll pass in whatever service, username, class. So if you can make your username look like an argument, you can then tell it. I think they use the example of
S challenge.
S challenge, and telling it to be like a password style login. You kind of see down here, if you could set your name to something like that, username equals -s challenge, or you can force this password style authentication, and then authentication is automatically successful and therefore bypassed. So this worked, and they do these case studies on a lot of these options where it works. They have their example going. Looks like so. Just I unfortunately didn't note down which ones all worked and didn't here. I believe this one works here with SMTP.
Yeah.
But when they talk about, or maybe it works. I know with some of these they talk about it. Yeah, like the radius D. It ends up they send the authentication request, but then it ends up crashing because of a null pointer dereference, because the get pwnem s challenge obviously gives you null. It doesn't exist. Similarly, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, a few of them actually do suffer from that too. So the one I noticed at first on was SU, which is used to switch user. That one has a null deref, and that's the one I noticed it on. I didn't notice that it also happened on SSH and on Radius as well.
Yeah, and so SSHD actually has some other things that basically it ends up rejecting it anyhow. They talk about you would have to bypass SSHD's authentication with an invalid user, because SSHD looks for it to be a valid user too. So it has like yet another layer, not just the null deref. It would still, I believe it will still crash, like if you were to have that as a valid user also.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so it's kind of a cool little attack, but yeah, a lot of these end up crashing because obviously the user just doesn't end up existing. Or they like get past authentication, but then they just die.
But that isn't the only issue that's in this security list. There's actually, I think, 2 more. So another
3
issue
more, yeah.
Had, oh, is it 3 more? Okay.
Yeah, so there is another one, which is a local privilege escalation with SU. It also xlocks it and s/key.
Yeah. So xlock, it just seems to be like an improper permission check. They don't check the ID properly. Like they should have called a function that they didn't. So there's an LPE through that. And then the S key and UB key one I thought was a little bit more interesting. That one, it seemed to be that they don't verify the files and the directories belong to the correct users. And it's writable as auth, so you can just add an entry for a file as root, and then like it just works. So that one seemed pretty cool as well. What was the third one though? Because I don't think I have any notes on that one.
Last the SU one is SU, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so I didn't really get a chance to look at that one because I missed it. So did you manage to see what was involved?
Yeah, so I mean, well, the summary here is a local attacker can exploit SU's a -L option, which is basically loop until correct username and password combination is entered to log in as themselves with another user's login class.
Okay.
Which unfortunately, actually, I'll admit, when I read this, I only really paid attention to the very first CV. I didn't notice these 3 following yet.
they put a lot more content in on the first one than they do on the other ones. So it's kind of easy to miss them if you're not paying attention. Because it's kind of weird. Like, yeah, they do all those case studies, right? So that's why it kind of, there's a lot more for the first issue than there is for the other ones.
Yeah, okay. So it looks like basically when you attempt to log in, that loop that it does, it looks like it ends up setting like this class object with the user that you're trying to log in as. So then if you basically on your repeated requests, in some cases you can get it to keep the login class information from the previous class or from like the previous user you tried to log in as. So you would basically get the class from root, as they use the example, the daemon class, and then log in as yourself.
So it's like an uninitialized thing? It's like
no, it looks like just it doesn't do the initialization in some cases. That's what it looks like. I'd recommend if anybody's actually kind of listening to this or wanting to look deeper, do look at it yourself, because I'm literally just reading this right now.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, overall, they are pretty high-level issues. But one thing I will say is they did have a fast response time. I think they said all these issues were fixed within 40 hours of being reported.
Yeah, that's down at the bottom there. They give their thanks over that for their response within 40 hours, yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, we kind of joke with Wide-OpenBSD, but I will say, like, they're probably one of the better ones when it comes to security in terms of, like, fixing issues quickly, obviously, like we're seeing right here, within 40 hours, and the mitigations and stuff. It's just some of these issues they still need to tackle. But, yeah, I mean, it's fun to meme on OpenBSD a bit. I mean, one thing I will say, I don't know if we want to go into a thorough discussion around OpenBSD. OpenBSD is one of those operating systems that you see people talk about a lot because of the security aspect of it. People are like, oh yeah, that's really cool. And like nobody uses it. I don't know if I've ever seen anybody or any business or anything like that actually run OpenBSD in a practical context.
Well, I mean, nope, I got nothing.
Yeah. So
I'm sure there are
operating systems.
Oh no, is there a licensing reason for that? Because I know FreeBSD is pretty permissive.
Yeah, that might be it. I just think it's just that people, like, they don't really care through going to set up OpenBSD.
Yeah, but I mean, like, why would, like, Sony, I think, is the good example here, using FreeBSD on the PS4. Why wouldn't they use OpenBSD, which has more security than FreeBSD? Like, they're already going to a BSD. So I have to assume that this has to do with...
Okay, Real Nano User says they're working on getting their global syscall lockout. Performance is rough. So basically what you're saying is they're using a lot of, like, giant locks, and their locking isn't fine-tuned, so that's why not a lot of people want to use it?
Yeah, well, if they are doing that would make sense with the mention of performance there. Because obviously if they're using large locks, that's going to drop your performance significantly. So it will increase security a bit in terms of races.
And that kind of makes me wonder, is that a design decision, and that they're not going to fine-tune it later on, and that they're going to keep it as like a global lock because of the how much easier it is to prevent races? There was literally a single massive lock on all syscalls. Oh, wow. I didn't know that. That's crazy. Okay.
Sounds like you don't get too many kernel races.
Wow, man. Well, I'm not going to look at OpenBSD, that's for sure. Screw that. That sucks. In terms of, like, finding races, but and in terms of performance. So that's a good point. I actually didn't know that, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, neither did I. I've never really been the one making those decisions, so just go along with whatever's already being used.
Yep. But yeah, I think the license, what you were saying about with the license, I think it's the same. I think they're all under a BSD license, so I guess it mainly does come down to, like, that performance aspect.
Yeah, I'm legitimately not sure, so
Yeah, it's just something I wanted to touch on a little bit before we moved on. So the next thing is CVE 2019 12750 Symantec Endpoint Protection Local Privilege Escalation. So this one, we talked about some antiviruses last week and hitting them in the context of exploits. Did we talk about Symantec? I don't think we did, but I just want to make sure.
No, I don't think last week's had Symantec. We have talked about Symantec stuff before.
I know
I just don't think it was
before,
last
I just
week.
don't think. Yeah, exactly. So this one talks about hitting the protection, and it even works on like Windows 1909, which is I'm not sure if that's the latest, but it's definitely pretty recent. So this is basically it seems to be a kernel issue in their kernel driver, which is sysplant.sys. So it's an ioctl. So they talk about this ioctl. They don't name it. They just put the ioctl number there. But basically, I'm just going to scroll down to where they talk about what it does. So it allocates a pool for hex 14 bytes in the paged pool, and then they allocate an MDL or a memory descriptor list. They probe and lock the pages to prevent them from being paged out, and then they map it into another virtual address range. But where they map it is in userland. So when that buffer is mapped, it's not just the buffer that's mapped, the entire page is mapped. So they end up leaking kernel data through that page. But the other problem is it's not only just the kernel data leak, but the changes are reflected between that userland mapped address and the one in kernel. So you can actually, and the page is writable. So you can actually make changes from userland on that page, and the changes get reflected in kernel memory. And because of that, you can obviously guess why that's going to be an issue. So yeah, it seems like it's a pretty trivial issue to exploit in the context of like when you're talking about kernel stuff. This is pretty bare bones in terms of what's needed to exploit it.
Yeah, I mean they talk about basically like they're able to just pull the tokens right off the memory page to do privilege escalation. So yeah, and I mean it's other processes that obviously it's kernel, so I mean it just comes down to they try to expose this small 14-byte buffer, and they accidentally just expose the entire kernel memory page. Yeah. So I mean, really simple, but also kind of subtle at the same time. Like it's really easy to understand as we're talking about it. Like they obviously do that, but it's also kind of subtle if you're not aware of how the mapping works. Like,
yeah,
it's
that
easy
is one
to
thing.
overlook.
Like, I do wonder why they do that. I'm not familiar with like Windows memory allocation, like how like the page pools and stuff work. It does seem weird that it does that, and I feel like
it would have to be performance related.
Yeah.
They're just they need to map the entire, or they need to work at that kind of page level anyhow. So they're just marking this page as like okay to read or whatever. I don't know the internals. That's my assumption. Though it generally comes down to performance.
Yeah. I mean, this kind of highlights an issue, though, with antiviruses. It does seem like the drivers that come with antiviruses are weaker in terms of security than perhaps some other drivers.
I don't know if I'd say that necessarily. Like, they might be. I just don't know if I've really got enough experience to say that it's worse than other drivers. A lot of the other issues we've talked about have been things like DLL related, where it'll have like a unquoted path or whatever, has I think been one of the more common things we've seen. So I don't want to just hate on the antiviruses as being extremely prone and having terrible code. Like it seems to me like a lot of drivers are just bad code, antivirus or not.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I will say like anecdotally, obviously, so I don't want to say this is like a hard fact or anything, but I do know some people who have looked at antivirus stuff, driver stuff specifically, and they do say like the code is terrible. Like there are issues everywhere. Don't get me wrong. I've done some work on antiviruses.
Okay. It was actually one of my earliest projects, professionally working was with an antivirus, and I remember remarking to one of my coworkers like, I really thought this company would have better code. Because I mean, like you think of the antivirus as being like, they're about security. You'd expect more defensive code. So I mean, like I do remember with this company, it was just like Yeah, I expected better of them just because they were an antivirus. Or because that was one of their main products, was this antivirus product.
Yeah. I want to say that I like this this blog post. I think it's pretty it's very accessible, like even if you're not familiar with Windows or kernel.
Yeah,
I
it's a
think
good
they do a
write-up.
good job. Yeah, it's a good write up. So I just want to say that. Maybe I'll use it when I go to look into more Windows kernel stuff, which I've wanted to do for a while that I just keep procrastinating on. But yeah, it does give like a good introduction into that. So we'll talk about the Omron. How do you say that? Omron?
I've
It's
got no
OM.
idea.
Okay, I'm just gonna say Omron. Omron PLC denial of service as a feature. I will say this page. I don't know why they do this weird highlighting of certain words. I
So it
found it kind
actually
of
seems like
distracting.
automatic syntax highlighting.
Yeah, I don't know. It's yeah,
It
because
seems like that
this.
might be running
Yeah,
and it's just treating everything as code. Although
yeah.
then I don't know about like they doesn't quite seem like. But seeing with this with until like those do seem like some Python, where it's like I could see this being, or I could see that being why. But
Not a
I,
huge
I
issue.
find
Just
the
something I
more
found distracting.
egregious issue from them is the CVS score of 9.8.
I know. I laughed at that, dude.
But anyway, so the issue here is that it's pretty easy to understand at its root. There's some network service that has a lock that can be acquired by sending a UDP packet to it. And basically this device tries to grab that lock in order to basically do anything. So if something else is holding that lock, it's basically just not going to work.
Yeah, you can just
So
infinitely hang it.
anybody can go and hit that lock, take the lock, and keep this device from being able to do anything. So basically, just an external attacker can hit this network lock and take it over. Kind of simple. So that's where the CVS score comes in. I've actually copied down kind of what they had their vector for it. So if we take a look at it, so like what they've got is a broken website here for me. There we go. So like what they've come up with, 9.8, like that's the actual score for what they've come up with in terms of their vector. The attack vector is network, needs a network attacker, attack complexity is low. I mean, you need to be able to reverse the packet or replay a packet, so it's not too bad. And the network kind of makes sense. I don't know enough about the access on that if it is locked down in some other way that might require adjacent, but we'll give it as network. Sounds like that's accurate. There's a brute force on this thing, like for brute force, like an FTP password on the same device, so network's probably correct. Privileges required. You just need to be on the network that said no user interaction required. So all the stuff on the left is okay, but when they come down on the right side, and scope's fine, but somehow this violates confidentiality and integrity. I think we all can agree. Yeah, I think we all can agree that availability is high. You're able to basically down the device, so that's fine, but it has no impact on confidentiality or integrity.
Yeah, so it should be about a 7.5.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the CVE, when I looked at it, didn't they say it was in review or something like that? So that score might change.
So it
I mean,
seems
it might be something
like
else I'm thinking of.
Omron just hasn't patched this. Like they're basically just not replying.
Oh, okay. So like, yeah, it might not even get a CVE.
Like, well, no, they'll get the CVE. So what happens with that is when the company doesn't reply to like the CVE request, it does get validated through another, like through the CVE numbering authority. So you don't need them to do it, like the actual victim or like the actual company or the vendor. They don't have to be the ones. That's the ideal case. Somebody has to validate it though. And this will likely be validated. I mean, there's no reason why they shouldn't get the CV, assuming this is a legitimate issue. But yeah, I mean, they just say like, "Hey, Omron, try harder."
Yeah, I saw that little dig at the end.
It seems like they've had a few issues. I did notice that their exploit code, started off with this nice little anonymous logo.
Oh boy. Oh boy. All right.
Which definitely kind of sets the tone. Like, I mean, okay, it doesn't actually change anything about this. I just noticed
that
that
is usually
it
a more
sets the
script kiddie
tone.
thing.
Yeah, it sets the tone a little bit. I mean, it's a legitimate issue. I'm not going to fault him on that or say, script kiddie. I mean, it's a legit issue here.
Oh
One
yeah,
of their
just
other
like
issues is like just
appears
brute
more script
forcing.
kiddie-ish.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought it was a weird thing to include.
Yeah.
I don't know much about these guys though. Like maybe that's something they do. Maybe maybe this is lolsec 2.0.
I mean, one thing that I think the company never replying to the vulnerability report kind of indicates that it's one of those stubborn companies. It's like, well, this is how it works, and we're not going to change it, and we don't think what you think is an issue is going to be as big of an issue as you think it is.
Yeah,
You know
or
what I
it
mean?
can just be that it didn't get escalated to the right people. Email bounced. Like
Could be that too.
there's a ton of possibilities. I mean, especially with a lot of these vendors, like they're not necessarily these huge companies, and I don't know how large Omron is, so I don't know about that. But like, there are a lot of small companies that just produce these things, like produce these little hardware things, and off they go, and they don't really have any system for reporting. And it's not necessarily that they're kind of acting almost maliciously. It's just ignorance.
I'm just like going off pure speculation here, but like when I'm thinking, like when I'm seeing, like when you factor in the details of the vulnerability, like how there's a lock file or whatever it is, like a lock that can be grabbed. When you're talking about fixing that, the only way you can fix an issue like that is if you like kind of overhaul that entire system. It's not like a easy quick fix, I don't think. And that's what kind of led me to thinking that this is one of those ones where it's just like, well, whatever, we're just gonna ignore it. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't seem like an easy issue to fix. That's what I'm getting at. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point actually. And I don't know enough about the product here to know how easy that would be to fix. Like that's kind of why I mentioned with the network aspect, like sure it's on the network, but like how controlled is access to that network? Like sure, okay, it's vulnerable, but like, if you can't really get on that network, if it's like a totally air gap network or something that's separate from the internet, that's separate even from like the local networks at like its own area, that adds a layer of control in front of it that can prevent this sort of attack. Won't completely eliminate it, but will still act as a hindrance there. Again, I talk a lot about layers of security, so there are layers that might be in front of this in its normal deployment that I'm just unaware of.
Yeah, and that I could absolutely see them saying, well, yeah, you could pull this off, but you need, because the networks that use these PLCs are air gapped, you're not going to be able to pull this attack off very easily anyway. So screw it. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
yeah,
like
that's what I was kind of getting at was what you were talking about there.
yeah, so like I said, I don't know enough to kind of make that claim. But yeah, like trying to fix this could be a difficult thing to fix, or it could just be adding some sort of authentication in front of being able to grab the lock.
So getting into our white papers, we have first contact, new vulnerabilities and contactless payments. So this paper talks about primarily two attacks on the EMV protocol. So EMV, do they actually state what it stands for here? I don't have that written down what it stands for. I'm just trying to find if they have the definition.
I don't know if they write it in there specifically.
No, they don't. It doesn't
But
say.
I mean it's a common um sorry. It's a common acronym that I don't actually know what it stands for, but it's referring to like your chip cards.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's like electronic, like
Something
yeah, I don't
verification.
know. Yeah,
Like, I do see what you mean that EMV is used a lot. I just wish, like, it's one of those things where it's like, if you don't know what it means, it sucks because they don't define it.
Well, I don't think it
wish they
really.
did.
Well, I guess if you know it refers to those types of cards or that payment method, I think that's kind of sufficient. Seems like EuroPay, MasterCard, and Visa is all it stands for.
Oh,
So yeah,
okay,
like it's
fair
not
enough.
useful to really know that. Like
Okay.
I didn't feel like I was hindered by not knowing what it actually stood for, as long as I understood that it was referring to like that sort of contactless card.
Yeah, it was just something that I noticed when I was reading through it.
Yeah, and I mean we complain about acronyms a lot in other papers, so it's fair to bring it up here.
Yeah. So the first attack they talk about is bypassing cardholder verification limits. So this is like when you go to a store and you go to tap for, like, if you go to like Best Buy and buy a computer or something, if you try to tap for something that's like $400, uh, usually it won't work. It depends on like what the limits are set at on the terminals and stuff like that.
Well, on the terminal and on your card.
And on the card,
The
yeah.
limits are set in both places. The problem here is that the limits are only verified by the terminal. So the terminal can be like, I don't care what your limit is, I'm charging you more.
Yeah. And they say that consumer device cardholder verification method transactions have a higher limit than the ones that don't have that. So I think they give an example on page 10, like the difference is like $550 versus $30. But like you were saying, like...
But still, I mean, the issue itself is just those limits are enforced on the terminal. So a malicious terminal can just decide to ignore whatever limits your card does.
So I will say I did learn a few things from this paper. One thing they highlight, and I think it's kind of like kind of supports what you were saying there with how the attack worked, is a lot of people think like the card initializes the transaction, but the terminal actually does. The terminal does a lot of the heavy lifting. So like when your card gets near the terminal is what like starts doing stuff, not the card. And that's something that I didn't really know, and I think that is like I think that mainly what I'm trying to say is like the terminal does more than I think we give it credit for.
Yeah, well, I mean, and the other thing is that they kind of tried to keep it somewhat light, and that's an issue because that means, well, certain parts of the protocol do get some verification or like limited encryption. By and large, after any sort of authentications happen, there is no encryption, so that's where like these limits are shared and can be tampered with and modified. If the protocol were to be authenticated across like the entirety, that would kind of limit some of this. Obviously, like I said, the terminal itself can decide to just ignore it. But the other thing is the replay attack is essentially a replay attack, recording one transaction and replaying it elsewhere. Because some terminals will ignore a counter value, which is basically like every time you make a transaction, the counter value goes up. And ends up getting sent to be verified by the terminal. If the terminal doesn't actually check that counter value is what it should be, like, hey, the card's telling me that my counter's 500, but this transaction looks like it came from like counter 400 or something. It just ignores it and keeps going with the transaction.
Yeah, so I mean, in theory, it should be secure against replay attacks, but I think it's like you were saying, there was the transaction counter. That they don't reject lower values. But the other thing too was they say that the unpredictable number they use for the cryptogram, it's not, there's no restrictions from preventing a terminal from using the same unique number over and over again. So those two things combined kind of make it like, it's one of those things where in theory it should be secure, but in practice it's not, because the terminal doesn't have the proper restrictions to make sure that
it comes down
secure.
to that terminal being able to make this less secure.
Yeah. So that was the main focus of the paper.
Yeah, and the paper itself felt really weird. A lot of our
very
paper,
dense.
Well, I was going to say I was actually going to go the other direction. Felt a little bit fluffy. And that's largely just because of all the pictures. Like the picture. Oh yeah, here's somebody using the NFC.
Yeah, you know what? I want to rephrase that.
And here's a picture of a smart card, and like it adds a bit, but I don't know. A lot of our papers that we cover don't include a ton of pictures, or don't include so many. It definitely felt a little bit like fluff, but it's not a bad paper because of that. But it did feel almost like it felt like a paper that I'd have read in university, where it's like you're adding the pictures to increase the page length. Now, and I'm not. I don't know why they did that, and the pictures do kind of add a bit. It was really surprising to see so many pictures in it. Obviously, that's completely unrelated to the quality of the content, and the content is pretty good here. I think it was pretty readable.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I do wish that it did take some digging to get to what the actual issues were, because they do provide a lot of background, which I guess is good, but I think there's a little bit too much, especially when you factor in those pictures. That being said, I mean, they do have a table of contents to more easily get around, which I thought was helpful. So, I mean, yeah, it's I just think the paper is a little bit longer than it needs to be. I shouldn't have said dense. That was kind of a bad word. I should have said, like, I guess you kind of summed it up pretty well with fluffed. That's probably like the best way you could say it. But yeah, like you said, it doesn't detract from the content of it. It was just a little bit longer than it needed to be for me.
Yeah.
But the issues were interesting, and
yeah,
I did get a bit of a perspective on contactless payments. Like, I didn't know how much responsibility was put on the terminal as opposed to the card, and I think that is useful information to know if you use that kind of payment method often.
Yeah, we covered kind of a not really similar issue, but related issue about these sort of contact payments, where they talked about creating a wormhole for the payments, which was a bit of a replay attack also.
I remember that vaguely, yeah.
Yeah, that was, I think, before kind of our last break, when we talked about that.
Yeah, probably, that sounds about right. But yeah, I mean, overall, good paper, just a little bit too long.
Yeah, it looks like that was episode 7.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, so it was a while ago. Okay. So, moving on to some fun stuff, we have Fuzzing Sega Genesis emulators.
Actually, I will just mention, Mr. Gabe mentioned, I feel like the pictures are good for people so they can kind of understand the context of what is going on. And I agree, there is a place for the pictures. I felt like it was a bit much in this paper. Some of them definitely add to it like that and giving some context, but some of it, I mean, maybe it would have been better if they just used smaller pictures.
Yeah, they were like full-size pictures. That was part of the issue.
Yeah, but yeah, so moving on here, as you mentioned, Fuzzing Sega Genesis emulators. This is more just a shout out to the project. ZZ Knob had posted this, looks like yesterday. Just kind of a fun little project, using Golang and writing a fuzzer for Genesis Simulator.
I do love Golang. I will say, like, he says that the fuzzer is not like, it's not like groundbreaking. It doesn't use code coverage. It's not like a high performance fuzzer, so it's not meant to, you know, like you said, it's more of a fun project. It's not meant to be used outside of, you know, finding some really dumb issues.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to mention it out there, though. It's just, you know, just calling out a cool little project. I mean, this is one of those projects. Yeah, it's not groundbreaking. It's not world changing. None of the issues discovered here are likely to have any significant impact to the security of anybody. But yet, you do it because it's there and it's fun. So I'd like to kind of call out that stuff because, I mean, I think for a lot of us, sometimes you just don't know what to go and try next. And I don't know, maybe you'll get an idea out of this or take a look at it or whatever, but...
I mean, since it is a dumb fuzzer that isn't like super complex and optimized for performance, it will be a bit easier to parse if you're not incredibly familiar with fuzzing and want to break into it. So I think it's useful in that regard, especially like in a language like Golang. Maybe I'm a bit biased because I like Golang, but I do find it's easier to read. And I think part of what makes fuzzing hard to break into is when you look at a lot of modern fuzzers, because of all the tricks they do to try to get higher performance, it just looks like nonsense, trying to parse what's going on. So because this isn't using coverage guided and it's not high performance, the code will be simpler and easier to understand. So yeah, it'll be useful in that regard.
Which is a fair point. Like I said, I was more interested in just in the fact that it's a cool little target.
Yeah. So,
although I do want to mention this white border around the entire page. Not my favorite web style. I'm pretty sure that's intentional. Not a preferred style to me.
Okay, I was wondering because I don't remember seeing that when I looked at it originally.
That's not just our issue. That's that's actually the design of the page.
Yeah, that is super weird. It's like looking at a TV or something.
Well, I could get that if they also did like SVG filter or something over this that had like scan lines. Then it sort of starts to make sense if they were going for that effect, which could be a fun effect to do too. But I don't know. It kind of bugs me a little bit. Again, this is kind of like complaining about the pictures. This is just something we're noticing. Doesn't have any substantial impact here. But something that does have kind of some substantial impact. I don't know. Did you have anything else to say on this?
No, I'm good.
Yeah, I want to move on, and I've kind of got two things I want to mention. We've talked a few times about electronic voting. We talked about it back in, I want to say like May or April, back when there's like the Swiss voting, some of the issues found there. We've talked about Microsoft's election SDK, not to be confused with Electron, which is like Microsoft's open source, homographically encrypted voting system. So we've talked about those, and recently there's a post put out by this Russell Cohen, and I'm not familiar with him, but just kind of a primer on verifiable voting. So I've talked a few times, like, I'm in support of electronic voting. I don't think we're at the place where we should be using it for anything important right now. Like, I still think we're a decade plus out from really having the level of trust in the systems that we need. But I do think we should be working towards getting that trust. And one of those things is this idea of verifiable voting, where in an ideal case, basically everything could be compromised and you can still have some trust in your votes. Like, the voting machine could be compromised, but you can still trust your vote was counted because of the math. Trusting the math, basically. Anyway, so it's just a good primer on this whole concept of verifiable voting that I kind of want to call out here. Link's going to be down in the description. And it talks about one particular method. There are other methods of doing this. I've mentioned previously, if you go back to our Swiss vote episode, which I'll actually figure out what episode that was. Looks like that would have been episode 2. So if you go back to episode 2, I talk more in detail about one verifiable voting method. This is another one. It's just another option on how to do it, but it's a good overview of it. And I do think because there's such a hard response, like a lot of people hear that electronic voting and immediately kind of dislike it. And kind of adding fire to that has been Tom Scott. And I don't want to hate on him by any means, because I do like a lot of his content. So he's the guy behind like Computer File, Math File, and then he has like his own channel which does some cool little videos. Like, I like a lot of his content, but it looks like about 5 years ago he did this why electronic voting is a bad idea. And just today, actually this morning, he did another one on why electronic voting is still a bad idea. Okay. Which was very well timed, because I was planning just to cover this voting primer, or verifiable voting primer, but this video kind of came out today. And he raises a lot of the same points as before, which is basically you need to be able to trust the software and the computer. They're not regularly tested, it's not transparent, and verifiable voting does approach some of these issues. And he doesn't deal with that at all in his own video. He talks about blockchain. That's one of the new things that he adds, is basically, the issues with blockchain. And blockchain is not a solution to any sort of voting stuff. Either way, it's 2 resources. I'd recommend reading that verifiable voting or watching the video and then giving that a quick read to see how it tackles some of his issues. I'll just kind of give the quick summary to say that the biggest issue comes down to he pushes for, and this Tom Scott kind of pushes for the average person being able to trust in the system is essentially what it comes down to. Is, you know, a lot of these complex things that you might be able to trust it, but you can't explain that trust to an average person. An average person isn't going to understand how to, and isn't going to be able to actually have that trust. And that's a point that isn't really solved by using any sort of encryption here. But what does happen is more people can kind of be in the circle with verifiable voting. More people are able to actually see like the published votes run because of the benefits of homomorphic encryption, are able to kind of run the counts themselves and have some level of trust in the results. Whereas right now you kind of have to be the person doing the counting to really be able to trust that they've been counted correctly, and we've already seen issues with that. So he does make that one fair point, and I'll concede that point, but I think it's just, you know, is that really what we need, or do we need trust elsewhere? Because we've seen tons of issues with paper voting. I don't know. It's just an issue because I do think electronic voting is a good idea. We're not at the point of using it yet. And it depends on the context of what he's saying. If he's just saying like right now, it's not like I'd agree we shouldn't be switching to it. Like for, you know, the US, you guys have the 2020 election coming up. Shouldn't be switching to electronic voting for that, but I don't know. It's something we've talked about a few times, and this came out just at a good time since, like I mentioned, I was planning to pull out this primer. So give that a read if you're interested. And I think just kind of to end off with, we've got L3 Age or AGE or AG3. Sorry, I'm not exactly sure what you're going with there. If that's supposed to be like beige,
leggage or something. Or I do want to say before we answer his question though. So with his video specifically, I didn't get a chance to watch it before we did it. But are you basically saying that his video is kind of one-sided? Like he doesn't kind of take a look at the defenses to the issues he's talking about?
No, if I were he definitely takes a look at a lot of the issues that can be brought up. I feel like it's a little bit of a straw man because he's not using the strongest arguments in favor, but he is using the most popular arguments.
Okay, I see.
So no, like I don't think it's unbalanced. Like I like his content for the I like a lot of the channels that he's strongly, so like I said, Math File, Computer File. I like a lot of them when he's not the one actually presenting. Like when they bring on like the expert in something. Oh no, I remember like there's this password security video of his. And it's clear that like, you know, he maybe Googled it beforehand or had somebody write the episode who wasn't an expert in it. Because it basically stopped it stopped at like hashing with assault, if I remember correctly. It ignored the whole, you know, like PBKDF2, bcrypt, scrypt, which were things and were actively recommended at the time he created the video and were the current best practices. It just seems like a lot of his videos, when he's kind of the one doing the technical aspects, he's not an expert in them. Somebody else has just kind of written that, and that kind of shows through. That said, I mean, his own channel, like the Tom Scott channel, usually he's the main one on there. Like, they're great videos. I do like his content, but that's something I've noticed. I really like the content when they bring some expert on for the most part.
Okay, I just wanted to like clarify that because I just wanted to make sure. I mean, I will say like.
He covers a lot of the issues. It's just he doesn't cover a lot of the issues that are actually being tackled right now. Like, he doesn't talk at all about verifiable voting except in passing, where it's like, well, nobody can trust the numbers. And that's kind of the point I gave him, where, you know, he makes a fair point when it comes to whether or not users can actually trust or like be taught why they should be able to trust this. I'd raise kind of the counterpoint. Is that where the trust is needed? Or is just opening up the entire process to be trustable so anybody can go and learn what's needed to trust it? He also mentions, like, you know, in order to break an electronic election, you don't need to break the election itself. You just need to cast enough doubt. So, like, take a picture with a USB stick attached to the machine and be like, is this supposed to be there? And tweet that out. It gets retweeted by 1 million people who, you know, clearly something's going on with this election. But you could do the same thing with paper voting. tweet out, oh yeah, I'm tossing out, or I burned, this box of, or I found this box of votes just tossed out behind the voting station. You could do the same thing there. Like, it's not a problem that's unique to electronic voting. Casting doubt on the election is just, basically, it's just a trick of the trade to try and control the results of an election.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, I mean, he's generally balanced. I don't want to fault him on that. Like I said, I keep repeating this. I do like his content. But I feel like he kind of just missed this whole area, which may be because it's very active in research. Like, it's something that's very new. And like, I agree with some of his points too, in terms of like, being able to trust that the open source software is actually what's running on there, because, that's true. Like, I don't think voting systems should be closed source machines.
Okay.
And things like, he makes very valid points. He brings lofty arguments, just not the arguments that I would necessarily make. That's why I think, it's worth learn a bit about the verifiable voting and watch that, or go the other way, watch it and read that, and you'll kind of see what I mean. But yeah, I don't know, anything else, or we can move on?
Yeah, no, I just wanted a little bit of clarification on that, just where I hadn't watched the video. But yeah, we can get back to that question with the how should I get into hacking. I kind of cut you off there, so
very vague, open-ended question.
Say that. I mean, it's very like it's you have to be a lot more specific what you define as hacking. I mean, like web app stuff or binary stuff or
pen testing. I mean, that's the thing. Yeah. Like, a lot of people, kind of use the term interchangeably. Like, I'll say this: most common misconception that a lot of people have is, one, that the only hackers professionally are penetration testers, kind of ignoring those that do like exploit development and vulnerability research. And which is kind of the most common misconception, is that penetration testers generally don't actually write exploits. They are what were traditionally called script kiddies. Now, to be clear, I'm not trying to insult all the pen testers out there.
Have a bunch of angry mobs.
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for the pen testing, because, yes, in one sense, they're just using kind of the known exploits. And going back to the 90s and stuff, in those days when, terms like script kiddie were coined, it was referring to people that just took all of these exploits that were being developed and just went and used them on like these random or use them even as a professional, being like, oh yeah, you're vulnerable because there's this exploit, but not really adding anything to that. Nowadays, pen testing is a lot more difficult than that. Like, pen testers do bring value, and like, there is effort and there is work that goes into it. It's not the same as those that write the exploits. It's taking advantage of misconfigurations. It's understanding the entire network, the entire system, and taking advantage of assumptions of some systems to attack them. So it's different from those that kind of write the exploits, which is kind of where I've worked, and where, like, Spectre doing the PS4 exploits, that's more on the vulnerability research side of things, which is what I tend to refer to when I talk about hacking rather than pen testing. But hacking could refer to the pen testing, could refer to writing exploits and like working at that level. I'm sure we can come with other places that hacking can mean also. So
I mean, you could be like the media and just call phishing a password hacking.
Yeah, well, so the media kind of takes the idea of hacking as any unauthorized access to a digital system. And that's fair. I always try to kind of specify what type of hacking I'm talking about, because there is also hacking in the programming sense. There's hacking in the prank sense, which is kind of where the term originates out of. There are other ways to use the term hacking. So yeah, the media's definition is just, any sort of unauthorized digital access. But we definitely do use it here as a more specialized term, usually in reference to actually developing exploits, and rather than just using the exploits.
Yeah, I mean, I will say definitely there is value in pen testing as well, just because like knowing how to use those tools that come with pen testing is like a valuable skill. I don't want to like downplay it.
Yeah, well, not even using the tools, like having that wider understanding of the entire network and being able to, pull some of these attacks, because it's not as easy as just running the tool. There's so much more to it than that I don't think they necessarily get enough credit, but at the same time, pen testing is kind of the sexy job right now. It is kind of the job that a lot of people, you think of hacking as a job, you go immediately to that network pen testing.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we didn't come off as like elitist, like you're not a true hacker if you don't write exploits. That's obviously what we're interested in, but there's definitely value in pen testing and stuff. But yeah,
no, I mean, I've said for myself, like I've done a handful of network pen tests. I don't think I'm great at it. I think I'm all right when it comes to the exploit dev, like kind of more software focused. But like it's a completely separate skill set that's doing network pen testing. And like it is very much a hacking skill set also. It's just different. It's just, it has like a different background. And so to kind of answer the question after all of that rambling is, narrow down what you actually want to do. If you want to go kind of more pen testing, I mean, learn to do like the general sysadmin stuff. CCNA as a certificate, kind of learn kind of your networking stuff, because everything's kind of about the network. So if you know how to be a good sysadmin, you're going to have a reasonable idea about the security issues you're facing. Obviously, you'll need to learn the specifics of security, but you start off by getting that foundation as more like a sysadmin. If you want to look more at the software exploits, then, get that more closer to a development background or a computer science background. If you want to do like the binary level exploitation, it helps to know how to at least write some code. You don't need to be like the expert programmer, but you do need to have some background in development to understand the software that you're looking at, to be able to look at software and, understand what's going on. Something that, maybe you don't need the same understanding as a pen tester, but doing the exploits, you need to be able to understand the software level, but you don't need to worry too much about the entire network and everything else that's interacting with that software. Unless, of course, it's like a networked application, there are reasons to do that. But, if you want to look at the web stuff again, learn to write the web applications, learn those web stacks, and then add security on there.
We'll steal just the Dark Souls mantra. Get
good. Taking what Mr. Gaither says, so basically just get good. No, but I mean, get the foundation in either like web development and just general software development, in being kind of a good sysadmin. Take that foundation, and once you have that foundation, you'll kind of know what you need to do for getting the security topics. When you start looking at just specific security things, you'll have a much better understanding if you have that foundation. So that's where I'd start off with that. If you want to ask, we're going to end the episode here, but if you want to ask kind of more specifically, like getting into a particular area, we can go into that.
Yeah, I mean, you have a few minutes while we sum up the end of the podcast. So if you do, if you catch it in time, we'll try to answer it. But if not, maybe we'll just answer it on the next podcast or something like that.
Or drop a comment.
Yeah.
So I mean, we both definitely have recommendations for people to get into areas, but it's not, without knowing where you want to go, we can't really answer that.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we don't have any more topics to cover. So that's pretty much going to sum up the podcast. I'll end off by saying we are going to be doing the Wednesday stream, or I'm going to be doing the Wednesday stream for the Android kernel debugger stuff at 8 or 9 Eastern. So tune into that if you're interested. And I'll be doing it on Friday as well, because the Wednesday's a makeup one and not applying makeup for not doing it on last Friday.
I was really excited that it would be, proper makeup, but
I'm sorry to disappoint you. But also, if you were interested in those Binder UAF streams and you didn't manage to catch them all, or you just want like a more summarized, nicely cut up video that cuts out a lot of the filler, you can check out our YouTube channel, and we have the Bad Binder video up that has a supercut of that. That's about 90 minutes if you want to check that out. So, just doing some self-content shoutouts. We will be back again next Monday.
And before we cut off, I will say to Mr. Gate there, code auditing is a weak area for me. If any of you want to address it, mostly binary code auditing. The Art of Software Security Assessment and Writing Secure Code are probably two books that you might want to take a look at. Writing Secure Code, I think there's a newer version. I think it's a pretty old book. I want to say I think it was published. Was it a Microsoft book? Yeah, it was a Microsoft book. Oh yeah, back 2001. That said, it's a good starting place, but I think the biggest thing is really just getting the experience working with the code.
Yeah, jumping in and doing it.
Yeah, so I mean, when you say binary code auditing, I'm not sure if you mean like doing a disassembly and like looking at the binary or the assembly level and auditing at that level, or if you still mean like source code auditing. Okay, yeah, that's going to be a little bit different. I was saying, he did say, yeah, IDA. That'll be a little bit different.
Binary
yeah, I don't know.
I mean, more difficult because it's harder to get an overall understanding.
Yeah, I'll spend a lot more time fuzzing than I will actually auditing the binary code itself to find an issue. I might look at a specific area, but I wouldn't try and audit an entire application by only reading the binary.
Unless you're only looking for like surface level issues. Like it's hard to find subtler issues in binary, especially if you don't have a lot of symbols to work with. So yeah, fuzzing's probably a better way to go if you're looking at like a pure, no source code access level perspective.
Yeah, or at least like fuzzing will give you the area to look at later. So like, hey, this area gets a bunch of crashes, so now let's look at the code and try to get that understanding.
Root cause analysis in binary, but don't do the initial finding.
Yeah, I don't know too many people that would do the whole thing in just straight up binary.
Wizards, maybe.
I mean, there are cases, obviously, you mentioned, like the PS4 is mostly binary auditing. Although with that, you do have a lot of the FreeBSD parts, and then you can fuzz kind of the random syscalls, or do a little bit of work to figure out how to fuzz them.
Yeah.
So, no, Spectre, have you used any fuzzing off the PS4, or has it been a lot of binary auditing?
PS4, it's been more binary auditing. I mean,
actually, I guess PS4 though. I guess you also kind of have a number of end days being used too.
Well, 1.76 was an end day. It was the bad IRET bug. So yeah, none of that was really binary. 4.05 is probably the only one that was actually binary auditing, and it was a bit of a service level issue, just in the fact that it was in a Sony system call, and because there's not a lot of Sony system calls, it's not too unreasonable to reverse at least the initial level of all those syscalls. Like there's people that have reversed those, maybe not like all the functions that they call and stuff like that, but it was not too difficult of an issue to spot from a binary level. But the later ones were all FreeBSD and found in FreeBSD source. Like the BPF stuff was all in FreeBSD source. So there's not been a ton of stuff at the binary level. Only really the one firmware for exploitation of PS4.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of that when it's closed source just comes down to testing methodology rather than actually auditing the binary itself. Like I said, I'm sure there are some guys that are really good when it comes to reading the assembly and can get that like really solid high level understanding by reading that assembly. But I know for myself, the times that I have kind of need to tackle kind of black box binaries, it comes down both fuzzing and just general testing methodology rather than needing to actually audit it by hand. It seems, I don't know, maybe if I had like an infinite amount of time, I might be more willing to spend it on the binary. But yeah, fuzzing gives you kind of a good return on investment for the most part. And just kind of knowing how to test things yourself or what things might go wrong and looking for that where you can.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much more to add on to that.
Yeah, I guess that's not really a good resource on getting started, but, we're basically just saying get good.
Yeah, pretty much. But yeah, we'll sum up the podcast there. Once again, check out our streams on Wednesday and Friday, and our YouTube channel for any VODs. But yeah, we will be back again next Monday. We thank you guys all for tuning in, and we will see you guys then.